In the growing shadows of a chilly New York night, Marcus Evans stepped into the famous Madison Grill, the place shimmering with warm lights and the soft hum of conversation. His suit was immaculate, the knot of his tie perfectly straight, but none of that did anything to shield him from the glances that followed him through the door and lingered a beat too long. Some people just looked away quickly. Others let their gaze hang heavy for a moment, sizing him up, unsure if he belonged. Here. Marcus pretended not to notice, the same way he had in so many rooms throughout his life. He just wanted a quiet dinner, nothing more. He hoped, even for a little while, to set aside the complicated feelings that came with being one of the first black judges serving on the New York Supreme Court. There was a pressure that never fully left him, a sense of always being on display, always having to prove something, not just for himself, but for countless others who might follow or had tried before. Tonight he was tired, and the weight of it pressed on him as he gave his name to the host, who forced a polite smile. The clinking of silverware, which normally faded into the background, seemed especially sharp. Every scrape and clatter echoed his own anxiety. As Marcus was led to his table by the window, he felt the space shrink around him. Whispers mixed with the sound of jazz playing softly over the speakers. He took his seat with care, placing his briefcase beside his chair, arranging the napkin on his lap as he tried to ignore the subtle stiffening of the couple nearby. Marcus knew these little signs all too well. The way people drifted away or stiffened up. The way the bartender glanced his way but didn't come over. The way the waiter's greeting felt just a touch too formal, as if nervously rehearsed. He was not a stranger to nice restaurants or to this city, but still, the old barriers found new forms again and again. Success had not erased the discomfort. It just made the ways people doubted or resented him more subtle, harder to point out, but always present. As he picked up the menu, he took a slow breath, determined to enjoy his meal nonetheless. Around him, conversation went on as usual, but Marcus could feel every layer between him and everyone else, a reminder that some walls, no matter how high you climb, remain determinedly standing. As Marcus tried to settle into his seat, flipping through the menu and glancing half-heartedly at the choices, he couldn't help but let his mind drift toward work. The day had been long, filled with meetings at the New York State Justice Reform Council, hashing out tough cases and tangled policies that seemed to grow in complexity each year. Between names, faces, and legal arguments, his thoughts tumbled. The responsibility weighed just as heavy here as it did from behind his desk. Yet in this restaurant, the usual stress of his job took on a different shade. The tension in the air was almost stronger than the subtle scent of rosemary chicken drifting from the kitchen. In the comfortable glow of the dining room, Marcus found no comfort at all. Every few minutes, he noticed staff glancing his way, their eyes quick to flicker toward him and then quickly away, as if checking to see if he was causing trouble simply by sitting quietly. Other diners leaned in a bit closer to one another, their conversations carried out in whispers, the stubborn, sideways glances painting a picture clearer than any words. The wall was there, silent but solid, a force as rigid as any concrete divider. No matter how hard he tried to focus on tomorrow's case or the appeal he needed to review, the feeling of unwelcome kept breaking in. He caught snippets of conversation. From the next table, a chuckle cut short, a sentence murmured with a wary look over the shoulder, shoes scraping as someone shifted just a little farther away. The bistro's ambient soundtrack, a gentle mix of old jazz and soft clinking cutlery, couldn't cover the undercurrent of discomfort. Marcus gripped the menu a touch tighter, reminding himself that he had every right to enjoy a meal here, just like anyone else in the place. The food smelled as good as advertised, something about the combination of garlic and wine lingering in the air. Yet the fine flavors could not mask the growing chill. The sense of isolation settled over him, a winter wind even indoors, making him feel a mile removed from everything and everyone. Still, Marcus straightened in his chair, refusing to leave or to give in. Living in the city had taught him this much. Invisible boundaries were everywhere, but he wouldn't let them decide where he belonged. Not tonight. Not ever. The careful balance in the restaurant was shattered by the sound of boots echoing across the polished hardwood floor. Marcus recognized the heavy steps even before he turned his head. It was a different sort of rhythm, one that seemed designed to get attention and claim territory. 3 officers from the New York State Patrol entered, their uniforms pressed, badges gleaming, and each of them carrying themselves with a confidence that didn't leave much room for friendliness. At the front of the group strode Captain William Harris, a man Marcus had seen on television a few times but never met in person. Harris was well known in law enforcement circles for his hard-nosed approach and wasn't exactly famous for showing empathy. He made a point of looking straight at Marcus as they headed toward his table, the other officers spreading out just enough to make their presence impossible to ignore. The room, already cool with discomfort, seemed to freeze all at once. Conversations dropped off into near silence, cocktails paused halfway between lips and table. Harris didn't bother with any polite introduction. He gave Marcus a look that was all about establishing who was in charge and cleared his throat for everyone to hear. "I wasn't aware the grill had started taking reservations for anyone," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Do you have some reason for being here tonight, Judge Evans?" There was nothing subtle in his tone, nothing that could be misheard as harmless curiosity. For one heartbeat, Marcus considered ignoring him, but instead he met Harris's stare right back, refusing to let himself be pushed into a corner. Eyeball to eyeball, he held his ground, every instinct telling him not to rise to the bait, but to stand firm. His answer was steady and clear. "I came for dinner, just like everyone else." Other diners shrank into their seats, pretending to study their phones or looking out the windows, desperate not to get involved. The officers watched carefully, some with folded arms, others just shifting from foot to foot. Harris, however, didn't move, seeming to savor the tension. The expectations hung heavy in the air. Marcus representing the law's integrity, Harris the sort of authority Marcus had spent his life standing up to. It was more than just words exchanged in a restaurant. It was about worlds colliding, each refusing to give an inch. Marcus kept his tone even and his face calm as he looked at Captain Harris. He quietly took out his identification wallet and opened it just enough to show both his state ID and his judicial badge, the circular emblem, glinting under the soft restaurant lighting. "Judge Evans," he said simply, his voice low but clear enough for the people around him to hear. For a second he hoped that the formality would reset the interaction, maybe remind everyone, officers included, of the standards expected in a public space like this one. But the moment dragged out, and no such respect arrived. Instead, Harris smirked, and one of the other patrol officers, a younger guy with an eager look, let out a short, almost mocking laugh. The third officer nudged his partner, and the two shared a glance that said they were unimpressed, if not outright dismissive. The reactions weren't loud or dramatic, but they didn't need to be. Even those tiny gestures, the soft laughter and rolling eyes, stung as much as anything that might have been shouted. They sent a message that the uniform, and what it represented, was the only thing that mattered tonight, not Marcus's title, achievements, or right to be there. If there had been any doubt about the hostility in the room, it vanished now. Even the servers behind the counter hesitated, unsure if they should step in or simply disappear altogether. The diners who had pretended to be busy with their conversations were now frozen, some looking apologetically at Marcus, others staring at their plates as if wishing they could vanish into the polished wood. A wave of frustration and helplessness threatened to flood Marcus, but he pushed it back with every bit of discipline he could muster. He'd spent years practicing patience in courtrooms, negotiations, and countless other moments like this one. His dignity was something no one could take from him. So, he sat a little straighter, met the captain's gaze, and refused to give ground. He reminded himself that real change only came when people stood their ground, even when it felt like absolutely everyone around them wanted to knock them down. Deep down, he felt a responsibility, not just to himself, but to anyone watching, anyone who ever felt out of place in their own city, to keep his head up, no matter how cold the room got. As Marcus focused on steadying his breath and keeping his composure, he noticed movement from across the room. Olivia Bennett, a waitress he had seen here before, was making her way to a table near his, but as she drew closer to where Marcus sat, she kept her gaze low, fixed on her notepad and her tray. When she reached the adjacent table, she spoke to the couple there, her words carrying toward Marcus even as her voice dropped to a whisper. "Sorry, I'm very busy tonight," she explained, almost apologetically. To anyone else, it might have sounded like she was simply rushing along with her work. But to Marcus, who had lived through this sort of thing more times than he cared to count, the message landed differently. Her eyes never met his. Even in this bustling restaurant in the middle of Manhattan, it was clear she, like so many others, wanted to keep her distance. Marcus felt the sting, familiar as it was. It was more than just being ignored. It was being quietly pushed aside, one more example of how acceptance here was never automatic for someone like him. The unease clung to him, colder than the air outside. He tried to tap into his logical side, reminding himself of statistics and scholarly arguments about systemic problems, ways he often made sense of the world's unfairness when faced with these moments. But reason offered little comfort now. He felt the humiliation right there in the open, nothing more than another silent lesson for the room about where boundaries really were. The urge to disappear tugged at him, a desire to make it all go away, to retreat into quiet just as he had so many times before. He didn't want to cause a scene, he never did. But as he watched Olivia briskly move away, avoiding all eye contact, Marcus was caught between wanting to slip into the background and knowing that to do so would let everyone hear off too easy. Familiar tension bubbled up, part shame, part anger, and part determination, a blend that had shaped many of his choices. He was tired of swallowing wrongs to keep the peace, yet still the line between dignity and silence seemed painfully thin. At that moment, every small gesture in the room seemed to weigh twice as much. But Marcus steadied himself, feeling the need to resist quietly, even if no one else was watching. Just as Marcus tried to steady himself, still feeling the sting of being brushed aside, he noticed another shift in the room's energy. It happened almost without drawing attention, but Marcus was quick to spot it because he had learned to keep his eyes open, especially in situations like this. At a table not far from his, a young man about college age, dressed in a Yankees hoodie and jeans, discreetly pulled out his phone. He angled it subtly, his finger gliding over the screen to start recording. The young man's name was Tyler Chen, and he blended in easily with the dinner crowd, looking for all the world like just another customer browsing Instagram while waiting for his food. But his expression was set, lips pressed into a thoughtful line, and his gaze flicked between Marcus, the officers, and the restaurant staff. Tyler recorded the way the officers stood too tall, their posture just shy of intimidation. He caught Olivia's hurried retreat and the nervous glances from the nearby tables. No one spoke to Tyler, but he knew this was the kind of moment that too often faded into silence if someone didn't capture it. From across the room, Marcus noticed Tyler's actions, and felt a subtle wave of gratitude, or maybe relief, wash over him. Nothing had changed yet, but it mattered in an odd way to know that someone else saw what was happening. Unfairness liked to hide in empty air, twisting itself in the shadows. A bright phone screen, even one held discreetly, could be enough to bring a little bit of that hidden truth into the open. The officers didn't seem to realize they were being filmed. Captain Harris had turned away, now arguing quietly with his colleagues by the door, possibly deciding whether to push further or back off. The air in the Madison Grill felt different, as if the spell of impunity that followed the officers and their uniforms was not quite as solid anymore. Tyler's phone captured more than just images. It caught the growing frustration, the little signs that the room itself might be waking up. Tyler's silent defiance was small, but there was expectation. In it, a hope that maybe things could shift, one share, one post, or one brave move at a time. Marcus took another breath, aware of the new energy growing quietly behind him, and for the first time that evening, something like cautious hope started to emerge through the cold. Within the group of officers, a subtle shift began to ripple. Not in words, but in the smallest change of posture. While Captain Harris kept up his stony front, arms crossed, jaw set, one of his fellow patrol officers, Daniel Morales, shifted uneasily on his feet. Daniel had joined the patrol right out of the police academy 3 years earlier, full of big ideas and pride in his city. But tonight, the way things were playing out at the Madison Grill was nothing like what he thought protecting and serving was supposed to look like. Daniel glanced over at Marcus, then back to Harris, and for just a split second, his eyes showed something different, uncertainty, maybe even regret. The look was quick, almost hidden, but Marcus spotted it immediately. Over years, on the bench, Marcus had become an expert in reading people. He didn't miss much, even when others were trying to hide behind bravado and uniforms. That brief flash of doubt was not lost on him. It flickered in Daniel's eyes and then vanished, as quickly as it came, buried under the weight of expectation from the group. This moment of hesitation set Daniel apart from his colleagues. While the others seemed content to keep up the pressure, their body language unchanged and their eyes staunchly avoiding Marcus's, Daniel's silence was different. It did not hold the same kind of hostility. Standing there, Daniel seemed caught up in his own internal struggle, as if reassessing the lines he had been trained not to cross. The quiet between the officers grew heavy for a moment, pressing on Daniel more than anyone else. Marcus felt that familiar ache, the hope that somewhere in the show of force there was still a person willing to see right from wrong. He knew all too well that giant systems didn't change overnight, and certainly not because of a hushed standoff in a Manhattan restaurant. But change started in small ways, with small cracks. And Daniel's hesitation, even if it stayed only a look, was a crack in the hard exterior that the officers wore. That hint of humanity was a reminder that even when the world felt solidly against you, there were individuals wrestling with their conscience, sometimes quietly, but always at the core of any movement forward. Just as the tension seemed ready to snap, the clink of dishes and the low hum of worried conversations were interrupted by another figure making her way through the maze of tables. Alice Russo, the manager of the Madison Grill, stepped forward from the back of the house staff area. She wore her usual crisp button-up and dark slacks, but tonight there was a seriousness in her eyes and a firmness in her jaw that made people take notice. Alice wasn't the type to usually step into confrontations, but she also had a reputation for treating every guest like the place belonged to them, no matter who they were or what uniforms wandered in with them. She walked right up to the officers, her hands held out in a measured, calming way, but her voice was steady. "Excuse me, officers. Is there a problem here that I can help resolve? This is a family spot, and we try to make sure everyone feels welcome here." There was a subtle emphasis on everyone, as her gaze flicked from Harris to Daniel to Marcus without missing a beat. Captain Harris stood his ground, staring her down for a moment as if he was deciding whether to bark out an order or just ignore her. But Alice didn't flinch. She may not have won any instant respect from him, but her effort did not go unnoticed by the diners. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Even Olivia, now near the bar, paused and looked back with a hint of uncertainty. Marcus watched as Alice's presence shifted the atmosphere. Her willingness to speak up, unlike others who had chosen silence, brought a new layer into the ongoing standoff. Alice's attempt to mediate didn't diffuse things straight away. Harris hesitated, the other officers stiffening as if waiting for a cue. Some customers still averted their eyes, but others watched with renewed interest. There was something brave and decent in Alice's refusal to brush things aside. For Marcus, it made all the difference to see someone try, even if the outcome was uncertain. This small stand sparked something in the room. The Madison Grill would never be mistaken for a protest rally, but with Alice's intervention, the sense that quiet acceptance was being challenged began to grow. Unexpected allies started to emerge, people who, just minutes earlier, had been content to blend into the background, now finding their own ways to show they would not turn away from what was unfolding. The fragile calm in the Madison Grill snapped, with the sudden decision from Captain Harris. In a show of raw authority, he stepped forward and, without another word, ordered Daniel to cuff Marcus. It was a move so out of place, so clearly without reason, that for a moment the whole restaurant fell into stunned silence. Daniel hesitated, but under the weighty glare from Harris, he pulled handcuffs from his belt and slowly approached Marcus. Marcus, still seated, offered no resistance. He kept his eyes up, jaw tight, while Daniel gently but firmly placed the cold metal around his wrists. The click of the cuffs was sharp, jarring against the background noises of clinking glasses and music. That sound, the small, cruel punctuation of steel, seemed to spark something in everyone there. At first, it was a ripple of whispered shock, but it grew quickly and loudly. Cell phones shot into the air, several diners determined to record what they were seeing. Tyler, already ready with his phone, moved around for a better angle, and a few others followed his lead. Alice Russo protested loudly, demanding to know on what grounds a sitting judge could be publicly cuffed in her restaurant, but her questions were drowned by the rising voices throughout the room. A couple at the bar started shouting that this was wrong. One man called out he didn't do anything, and a woman near the window boldly told her friend to call the news. The reaction in the restaurant changed almost instantly, from uncomfortable silence to heated uproar. People who had moments earlier kept their heads down were now recording, shouting, some even standing up from their tables. Olivia looked on, her own phone out, expression etched with concern and outrage. It was as though the whole restaurant had woken up at once, drawn together by the blatant injustice in front of them. Captain Harris and the other officers stood tense, suddenly aware that their actions were no longer in the shadows. The old certainty, the idea that no one would get involved, had vanished. Even outside, passers-by began to stop and peer in through the windows, curious at the noise and the raised phones. There was no more pretending nothing was happening. What started as quiet humiliation now overflowed, echoing out from the Madison Grill to wherever those videos and stories would travel next. As the heated voices filled the Madison Grill and cell phones continued to capture every second, a different kind of presence cut through the noise. At a corner booth near the windows, an elderly man set aside his coffee cup, using the table to steady himself as he rose. Everyone at the restaurant recognized him. Mr. Walter Green had been a lunch regular here for over 30 years, back when the block still had bookstores and the city's skyline looked a little less crowded. Though his hair was all silver now, his posture and voice still carried the weight of years spent as a respected history teacher in the Bronx. Mr. Green did not hesitate. He made his way slowly but with purpose toward the officers, waving away the hands of friends who tried to help him sit back down. When he reached the center of the room, just a few feet from where Marcus stood in cuffs, he cleared his throat. The conversations fell away again, and all eyes turned to him. He faced the crowd and spoke so that even the people by the kitchen doors could hear every word. "For anyone in this room who does not already know," he said, his voice surprisingly clear and strong, "the man you are putting in handcuffs is Judge Marcus Wyatt, who has given decades of service to justice in this city." He paused, letting it hang there. "He has settled cases that made a difference in New Yorkers' lives. He is here just to have dinner, like any of us." The shame behind the officer's actions grew starker with each word that left Mr. Green's mouth. Some who had been timid about speaking up now joined in, voices swelling with calls for answers. "What's your reason?" someone demanded. Another patron asked, "Is this how you treat everybody?" The room's energy changed once again, becoming that of a restless audience that now demanded accountability and not just explanations. "For Marcus," Mr. Green's words landed like a lifeline. The humiliated tightness in his chest loosened just a little, tension replaced by a small but growing sense of hope. After so much silence and indignity, someone had not only seen him, but made sure everyone else did too. As more witnesses rallied behind him, the officer's authority wobbled, their actions exposed for all to see. Before the tension could even settle from Mr. Green's declaration, yet another change swept through the Madison Grill. Sitting near the counter with her laptop bag by her feet, Amanda Rivers, a well-known city journalist, quietly slid her phone onto the tabletop and tapped the red "Go Live" button. Amanda had come in hoping to finally relax and grab a late bite after wrapping up a story. She'd been unnoticed until now, but as she watched the scene, her instincts took over. In a practiced but gentle tone, she explained to viewers, "This is Amanda Rivers, live from the Madison Grill in Midtown, where Judge Marcus Wyatt has just been handcuffed without explanation. You are all seeing this happen in real time." Word spread faster than anyone in the diner could have expected. People glued to their phones outside the restaurant noticed something happening inside, and a small crowd started to gather on the sidewalk. Comments began flooding Amanda's stream, and within minutes, her video was being shared on social media feeds all across New York City. The injustice, no longer bottled up inside the four walls of the restaurant, spilled into the streets and straight onto news feeds everywhere. Marcus saw Amanda's phone propped up beside the ketchup and salt shakers. For the first time since the ordeal began, he understood just how quickly attention could shift and how masks could fall away when the spotlight was pointed somewhere. Uncomfortable, the look in Captain Harris's eyes changed, his confidence wilting just a little as realization sank in. The people he had thought to intimidate were now documenting everything for the world to see. The officers, once so sure in their authority, now stood awkwardly, gathering glances from all sides. Daniel, still holding the handcuffs, looked especially shaken. Amanda's broadcast continued, her voice even but urgent. "We are asking why this is happening," she said, "and the community wants answers." As the story took off online, city officials, local reporters, and public defenders were tagged in tweets and posts. Every person in the restaurant felt the shift. The sense of isolation, of being at the mercy of unchallenged authority, was breaking apart. For Marcus, it was as though the clouds had started to break after a long, silent storm, allowing hope and truth to trickle in. The officers now stood exposed before a city that was finally paying attention. The buzz inside the Madison Grill, still humming from Amanda's live stream, quickly escalated to a full media frenzy. Within a handful of minutes, reporters started pouring through the front doors, their badges hanging from lanyards, microphones jostling for space in a sea of camera lenses. Outside, news vans lined up curbside, adding to the chaos as bystanders craned their necks to see what all the fuss was about. The restaurant, normally a place for quiet conversations and late-night pie, had become the backdrop for something that would make headlines all across the country. As soon as they caught sight of Marcus still in handcuffs, photographers snapped picture after picture. Bright lights flashed across the dining room, bouncing off the chrome fixtures and startling some of the regulars. The press wasted no time, demanding statements from anyone willing to speak. Tyler, who had recorded much of the incident, gave his account. Alice Russo, shaken but determined, defended her staff and her patrons in front of every camera that would listen. Amanda Rivers, live feed still running, carefully narrated the shifting events, making it clear to her audience the injustice that had unfolded. The image of Judge Marcus Wyatt sitting calmly in handcuffs, posture straight and head held high, even as humiliation burned in his cheeks, became an instant symbol. He understood just how exposed he was. This was pain of a different kind, out in the open for strangers and friends alike to see. He thought of his years on the bench, insisting on fairness and respect in his courtroom, and now he found himself needing to draw on every bit of that same strength. Headlines flew across news tickers within the hour, judge handcuffed while dining in Midtown. Allegations of racial discrimination shock city. The story swept from New York and out to the rest of the nation. Conversations lit up in homes, offices, and on subways, with people grappling with what the images meant for the country as a whole. Standing there, feeling the hard edge of the cuffs and the sharp gaze of every camera, Marcus sensed that something might finally come out of his pain. He was forced into this spotlight, but maybe, if people stayed watching and questioning, his public struggle could push the conversation somewhere it needed to go. The discomfort and outrage now belonged to everyone, not just him. In the midst of the flashing cameras and persistent questions from reporters, something truly unexpected happened. Alice Russo, still visibly shaking from the ordeal, stepped out in front of the gathered crowd. Her eyes darted over to Marcus, and then back at the officers, who looked more uncomfortable than ever with each new microphone pointed in their direction. All around her there were people recording, whispering, and waiting to see what would happen next. Everyone in the Madison Grill seemed to sense that things were changing, but no one really knew what form it would take. Drawing in a shaky breath, Alice spoke up so everyone could hear. "I want everyone to know," she said, her voice wavering at first but growing stronger, "that what happened here tonight was wrong. I saw it all with my own eyes, and I'm willing to testify on Judge Wyatt's behalf anywhere or at any time. This restaurant is supposed to be a place where everyone feels safe, no matter what they look like or where they come from." The hush that fell over the room was immediate. It was rare for someone in Alice's position to take such a public stand, especially with officers within earshot and the possibility of fallout hanging in the air. For Alice, the decision was not easy. She was well aware that speaking out could put her job on the line and might even bring unwanted attention to her personal life. Still, she pushed through the fear and finished with a steady voice. "I will not be silent because silence just helps this keep happening. If that means risking something for myself, then so be it." That simple but powerful declaration didn't just support Marcus, it sent a ripple through the restaurant and beyond. People began to look at one another, weighing their own silence against the courage it took for Alice to speak, Some muttered agreements, a few even clapped, but many just nodded, taking in the seriousness of the moment. It was as though Alice's bravery loosened the grip of an unspoken rule, that you were supposed to keep your head down, not get involved, and certainly not challenge anyone in uniform. The hierarchy that so often kept everyone quiet was suddenly shaken. Alice's stand inspired others to think about what it really meant to look away, and at that moment, the idea of standing up felt less frightening and a little more possible for everyone who watched her. It was not long before news of the night's events reached far beyond the Madison Grill. By early morning, word had traveled through group chats and social media to every corner of New York City. Social justice groups, as well as several legal associations, including the well-respected New York Bar Council, jumped into action. Posts appeared on Instagram and Twitter, calling for a public rally in support of Judge Marcus Wyatt. Some organizations released open letters urging the city to investigate not just the actions of the officers, but also the deeper issues at play. A handful of volunteers from these groups, many wearing bright orange buttons, arrived at the diner the very next day. They handed out flyers printed with messages of solidarity and invited patrons to join peaceful demonstrations that would take place that weekend on the steps of City Hall. Marcus, reading through the flood of emails and statements sent by former colleagues, students, and total strangers, felt a surprising mix of gratitude and almost disbelief. He had spent years on the bench trying to do right by the people who came before him, but it never really occurred to him just how many were paying attention. Rallies sparked up across the city, some as small as a dozen neighbors with handmade signs outside a subway station, others drawing hundreds to Foley Square. Friends from law school, people he knew through mentoring young attorneys, and even clerks from the courthouse, all came forward to speak out and offer their support. Photos of the demonstration in Midtown, people carrying signs that read, "Justice for Judge Wyatt," and "This is our city, too," made their way onto morning talk shows and radio broadcasts. For Marcus, the flood of kindness was overwhelming, but came with a heavy truth. His humiliation was no longer just his own. It represented the struggle of countless others who had faced the same shadowy prejudice but never found a spotlight. He realized that somehow overnight he had become a symbol. It was not a role he had ever wanted, but he felt the weight of it growing with every phone call and every headline. Now, the fight was no longer personal. The expectations and hopes of people all over the city rested on his shoulders, demanding that he find the strength to keep pushing forward, no matter how tired or exposed he felt. Each new act of support lifted him a little, but the responsibility pressed down all the same, reminding him that what had begun as a private injustice had become something much larger and deeply public. Amidst all the rallies and letters of support, there were quieter struggles happening too, ones that did not make the nightly news. Of all the people wrestling with their consciences, Officer Daniel Rhodes found himself in the deepest turmoil. He had not expected the events at Madison Grill to spiral the way they had. As the days unfolded, Daniel saw his own face appear in replays on the news and re-watched scenes of himself standing stone-faced while Judge Marcus Wyatt was handcuffed. The burden of his silence weighed heavier every time a news story broke or another protest filled the streets. Daniel tried to convince himself there was no way to change what had happened, but the guilt gnawed at him all the same. He barely slept, and when he did, he dreamt of Marcus's steady face, humiliated but never defeated. One evening, after walking endless loops around his small apartment in Queens, Daniel made a decision he hoped might finally bring some peace. He scribbled a note, tucked it deep into his jacket, and took a train to Marcus's address, memorized from the official reports. Waiting until dusk to avoid the reporters always nearby, Daniel rang the buzzer and stood on the stoop, his heart pounding and hands clammy. Marcus answered the door, surprised at the unexpected visit, but motioned for Daniel to come in. There was a tense pause. Daniel's nerves threatened to get the best of him, but he pressed on, his voice low but firm. "Judge Wyatt, I am here because I need to tell the truth, however hard that may be. What happened that night was wrong. I should have stepped in, and I did not. I am sorry." Daniel explained the reasons behind his actions, though he made it clear he was not making excuses. "If you want, I will testify, on record, in court, anywhere you need. It is the least I can do, no matter the risk to my job or the fallout." Marcus listened closely, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little as Daniel spoke. He saw not just an officer, but a human being struggling with the same forces that had knocked him down. Daniel's words, honest and trembling, planted a new hope. People could change, and maybe the cycle of silence and complicity did not have to keep repeating. The idea that an unexpected ally could make a difference gave Marcus more hope for real justice than he had felt in days. The days following Daniel's visit were a blur of tense meetings and phone calls. As Marcus tried to find his footing again, the case refused to fade from the spotlight. News continued to swirl, stirring up fresh debates across New York. The city's court system, not immune to the growing outcry, made a rare and bold decision. They would open a formal investigation into the Midtown Police Department. This was not just any inquiry. Officials called it an exemplary process, one meant to set a new standard. Judge Marcus Wyatt, they announced, would oversee the historic public hearing. The announcement itself sent ripples through every circle, from courtroom halls to casual coffee shop chatter. Headlines ran with the story: Judge Wyatt to lead public inquiry on police actions. For Marcus, it felt surreal to be invited not as a witness or a victim, but as the one trusted to guide the city through some very tough questions. The invitation was powerful, but it was also dangerous. All eyes would be on him, and the risks felt personal. For every message of encouragement, there were warnings, veiled hints from colleagues and old friends telling him to tread lightly. A few even suggested it would be easier to let things die down, to avoid dragging more skeletons out in public. The weight of it all settled around Marcus's shoulders. Running the hearing meant putting himself face to face with not only the officers who had wronged him, but also a system that had let prejudice linger in its shadowed corners. It meant questioning the hierarchy that both protected and betrayed him over the years. There were late-night calls from senior judges and subtle comments from acquaintances urging him to think carefully before going too far. The pressure to back off was real, and sometimes came disguised as concern for his well-being or career. Still, deep down, Marcus sensed he could not turn his back on this opportunity. Maybe, for the first time, there was a real chance to drag old truths into the daylight, to make sure what happened to him could not simply fade away and be repeated again. As he stared out his window at the city lights stretching from Harlem to Battery Park, Marcus knew he would have to face uncomfortable truths, even if that meant exposing flaws in the very system he had worked within for decades. He understood the risks to his peace of mind, his reputation, and even his safety. But the idea of helping the city, of leaving behind something stronger and fairer for those who would come after him, gave him the courage to take a step forward into the unknown. Behind the scenes, as the city focused on the upcoming public, hearing undercurrents of tension rippled through the precinct at Midtown. Captain Richard Holloway, respected for years inside the department, decided he had to act. Worried that Daniel Rhodes's willingness to testify might shake loose secrets that had always stayed buried, Holloway quietly gathered a handful of trusted officers in his small office. He tried to persuade them it was for the good of the department, urging them to talk some sense into Daniel before he took the stand. Richard used carefully chosen words rather than threats, leaning on the loyalty and brotherhood that held the squad together for so long. The discussion stretched late into the night, with Richard painting a picture of chaos that would follow if one of their own aired dirty laundry in public. But the cracks were already starting to show. The officers he'd called in, who once would have lined up to support the captain's wishes, did not agree as easily now. Several shifted uneasily in their chairs, glancing at the closed door and avoiding eye contact with one another. A few remembered what they had seen at the Madison Grill, felt the tension of that night and the doubts gnawing at them since. No one wanted to be the first to speak openly against Richard, but that old sense of unity felt thinner than ever. There. Silence was different this time, made heavier by what Alice Russo and Daniel had already risked. When the meeting finally broke up, the plan to convince Daniel backfired. Instead, words started to leak, bit by bit, through whispered conversations and phone calls after hours. Some officers, uncertain but willing, reached out quietly to Daniel, not to stop him, but to admit they understood why he was choosing to speak up. For Richard Holloway, this was something new. He began to feel isolated. Even as he walked the halls he used to rule without question. He sensed his power slipping, replaced by frustration and a creeping loneliness that followed him everywhere. Over the next few days, even little interactions changed. Fewer greetings in the halls, more side glances as he walked past. Meanwhile, Daniel felt that old pressure giving way to a strange clarity. The silence he had always accepted as part of the job now seemed much heavier and less necessary. For the first time, he saw that the cost of keeping quiet about the truth was much greater than he had ever let himself believe. As the courtroom drama played out in city headlines and precinct halls, something unexpected started to stir across New York. Some local teachers and neighborhood leaders decided it was not enough to just talk about the hearings and protests. They wanted to do something visible, something that made people listen and connect. That was how Pulse of the City, a vibrant cultural event against discrimination, started taking shape. It was planned for a Saturday afternoon at Marcus Garvey Park, with every part of Harlem getting involved. Public schools sent their art students. Music teachers brought jazz bands from Brooklyn, and community activists teamed up with muralists and local poets. Flyers promising food trucks, open mics, and interactive art walls fluttered on light poles from the Bronx all the way down to the East Village. What really caught the city's attention was the invitation sent to Judge Marcus Wyatt. Organizers wanted him not just as a speaker, but as the guest of honor, a living example that even people who carry the weight of injustice can shape something better. It was risky for Marcus, who was still navigating rumors and tensions after being chosen to lead the public hearing. Still, when he stood at the edge of the stage, hearing hundreds of school kids and neighbors clapping for him, something inside him shifted. As the music faded, Marcus walked up to the simple wooden podium. He looked out at faces young and old, at families holding signs, and at a few police uniforms scattered respectfully in the back. He talked about what it felt like to be judged for something you never chose, and how pain, when shared honestly, can become a kind of fuel for changing things. His words were not fancy or practiced. He spoke about the helplessness of that night at the Madison Grill, the confusion and disappointment afterward, and how it was people, ordinary ones, not heroes, who finally broke the silence and reached out to help him stand tall again. As Marcus finished, the crowd was quiet for a moment, taking in what he had shared. Then applause rose, first hesitantly and then growing louder. For many of those listening, especially the kids and young adults, his story made hope feel real where before there had only been skepticism. The feeling in the park was different that day. a kind of shared promise that things could start to change and that this moment might be the beginning of a new way of seeing each other. While the city was still buzzing from the energy of the Pulse of the City event, another wave of change was brewing, this time pushed forward by the local press. Over in Brooklyn, journalist Stephen Lee took a special interest in what really happened that night at Madison Grill. He was known for his thorough investigative work at the New York Sentinel, never shying away from digging into long-buried stories. Stephen started by interviewing current and former employees, as well as community members who had their own uncomfortable memories tied to the restaurant. Stephen and his team soon discovered a messy trail of ignored complaints and hidden reports about racism and discrimination at Madison Grill. They found emails sent to management that had never been answered, accounts from workers who said they were talked down to or outright dismissed whenever they raised concerns. In some cases, those who spoke out lost their jobs within months. His series of articles brought these patterns into the light, and suddenly Marcus Wyatt's experience was not just about a single evening or a single judge. It became part of a much bigger story about a place many New Yorkers had visited for years, imagining it to be just another neighborhood landmark. These revelations could not be swept under the rug, not with social media pushing every update directly into people's phones. The owners of Madison Grill could not pretend anymore that they were isolated incidents or misunderstandings. They started to get calls not only from reporters, but also from regular customers and social organizations demanding accountability. People wanted proof that things would really change this time. In the midst of this pressure, Sophie Green, who had only recently begun working in management but had grown up in the surrounding community, decided enough was enough. Sophie took it upon herself to organize a series of internal workshops for staff. She brought in local civil rights educators, set up seminars on unconscious bias, and made sure employees had a real way to report concerns safely. These sessions were not always comfortable, and some employees bristled at first, but Sophie stood firm. At the same time, New Yorkers across the city watched closely, expecting clear and honest change. Community leaders held open meetings, and the city council put out statements reminding local businesses that the days of looking the other way were over. No one wanted to slip back into silence. For the first time in a long while, the push for fairness became a city-wide effort, as everyone demanded that what happened to Marcus, what happened to so many, would not be ignored again. By spring, a sense of momentum had built throughout New York, shifting the atmosphere even in places that once felt immune to change. The headlines about Madison Grill slowly made room for a new story, one that involved Marcus Wyatt and Sophie Green working side by side. Their meetings started small, just phone calls at first, then long evenings after work spent making lists. At Sophie's kitchen table, together they decided the city needed something lasting, a foundation where people who experienced discrimination, no matter how subtle or open, could find support, resources, and a voice. They called it the New Light Foundation. Neither of them had experience in starting an organization from the ground up, and the legal paperwork alone seemed endless. There were times the project felt impossible, especially when they faced pushback from people who insisted things were fine as they were, or who thought their efforts would simply stir up trouble. Marcus and Sophie faced setbacks, from grants falling through to early supporters losing interest when things moved slowly. But every time they hit a wall, they reminded themselves what was at stake. They found courage in each other's determination. And every small success, like getting their tax exemption status approved or landing their first community volunteer, felt like a big win. By the end of that year, the New Light Foundation opened its doors in a small office above a Harlem bookstore. They ran workshops, set up a hotline, and even started working with local schools and businesses to teach practical ways to fight discrimination. What surprised them most was how quickly people found them, sometimes just to talk, sometimes needing help with a specific problem, always wanting to be heard and understood. As the year drew to a close, Richard Holloway, who not long before had been so certain in his position of authority, found himself alone, his old allies distancing themselves after everything that came to light. The loss of his role hit him hard, leaving him uncertain about what came next. One evening, feeling the weight of regret, Richard reached out to Marcus. Instead of anger, Richard found someone willing to listen. Their conversation was not easy, but Marcus encouraged him to take responsibility and to start over with humility, turning his past failures into a foundation for something better. That winter, as snow gently covered the city, it was clear that some cycles could be broken. Justice was turning into something bigger than any judgment in court. It was flowing into the roots of the community, planting seeds of hope where once there was only darkness.